Okay, well, I think I'll go ahead and start now, just so we're not delayed and people will come in. So, all right, let me just share. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Adriana Bankston. I'm the CEO and managing publisher for the journal Science Policy and Governance. So I want to provide a brief background on the journal for those of you that may not be familiar with what we do. So we are an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed research publication. We were established 10 years ago by senior leaders and young scholars in science and technology policy. And our mission is to catalyze the engagement of students and early career researchers in science policy and governance debate through policy research and writing. We publish policy papers from students, postdocs, policy fellows, and early career researchers in science policy. And through the journal, we also bolster their research and writing credentials in policy and encourage them to engage in debate and discourse and contribute to policymaking at all levels of government. So we publish a number of formats, OPEDs, technology assessments, policy memos and analyses, white papers, book reviews, workshop proceedings, and other research articles that cover every corner of science and technology policy. We also promote the publications through our global mailing lists, as well as events such as today's event, workshops, other webinars, and also podcasts where we interview published authors. And you can follow JSPG on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can see the bottom left. I'll share the links to our accounts later, but we also post all of our events on YouTube. And we publish both standard and special issues. The eligibility obviously is early career. The standard issues are open calls for submissions for articles in all formats on any corner of science and technology policy. And our special topics are sponsored by a partnering organization and focus in scope or topic. And again, the eligibility is early career and is also on the website. You're welcome to review that more as well. So on to today's event. So recently, JSPG, Unesco, and MGCY launched a call for papers and competition on open science policies as an accelerator of the Sustainable Development Goals. This will result in a special issue with a submission deadline of July 10th. And the issue is also supported in kind by outreach partners from the Global Young Academy Working Group on Open Science. And this webinar specifically is the second in a series of events that is meant to inspire and empower prospective authors with expert perspectives on open science policies, which can inform their submissions to the special issue. And the previous webinar was focused on open science policies related to infrastructure and capacity building. And this special issue, sort of framing a little bit, is focused on the UNESCO recommendation on open science, which covers a number of different areas. And the overall goal is to think about creating a more accessible, transparent, and more participatory way of designing, conducting, publishing, and evaluating scholarly research. More broadly, we want to bridge the science, technology, and innovation gaps between and within countries and fulfilling the human right to science and leaving no one behind. So again, I'll share the link to the call for papers. You can read more about the call there. So a few logistics for today. We like you to mute your microphones and stay up video so we can focus on the panelists, which I'll introduce in a second. And you can ask questions in the chat to me or the moderator, and we'll try to answer them as we go along. Today's webinar is focused on consolidating public participation in open science, engaging societal actors beyond the scientific community, and promoting the inclusion of knowledge from traditionally marginalized scholars. And we have a really distinguished panel here today. So I'd like to just briefly introduce them. First, we have Kate Hertweck, who is a program manager in open science at CZI. We also have Nick Shockey, who's the director of programs and engagement for SPARC and also organizer for OpenCon. Uta Win is the Elderberg Visiting Professor on Marine Citizen Science for Sustainable Development at Gothenburg University, and also an Associate Professor of Water Innovation Studies at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education in Netherlands. And last but not least, we have Rajesh Tandon, who is a UNESCO co-chair in community-based research and social responsibility in higher education, and founder and president of Participatory Research in Asia. And so thank you very much to everybody with joining us today. And with that, I'd just like to introduce our moderator, and then I'll turn it over to you. So Ona Ambrazaite is a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins. She was one of the MGCY SPI technology focal points. And a few facts about her: she participated in the Amgen Scholars Program in 2018 at Kyoto University in Japan. And she currently also serves as the Science Diplomacy Chair for the Johns Hopkins Science Policy Group. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for the warm introduction. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the attendees from around the world. It's truly my pleasure to be moderating today's panel, focused on finding ways to develop collaborative governance for open science through public participation and inclusive knowledge. So without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our 4 truly inspiring panelists whom we will hear from today. So first we have Kate Hertweck. Kate is a scientist and educator. Her graduate training at University of Missouri focused on genomic evolution of plants and was followed by postdoctoral fellowship at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center at Duke University, where they began working exclusively in computational biology. Kate then spent 4 years as an assistant professor and transitioned to supporting biomedical researchers in applying reproducible computational methods and other open science skills, first as bioinformatics training manager at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and currently at Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Our second panelist is Nick Shockey. Nick is the Director of Programs and Engagement for SPARS and founding director of the Right to Research Coalition. As the Director of Programs and Engagement, Nick is responsible for growing SPARK's engagement with members and the wider community, managing SPARK's digital platforms and developing initiatives across SPARK's program areas. In 2014, Nick led the launch of OpenCon, a conference series which brings together leading student and early career research advocates from dozens of countries to advance the issues of open access, open education, and open data. So next we have Uta Win. Uta is the 2021-2022 Adlerberg Visiting Professor on Marine Citizen Science for Sustainable Development at Gothenburg University and Associate Professor of Water Innovation Studies at IHE Delft in the Netherlands. Over the past 10 years, she has led action research on citizen science in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East related to water and environment. As a member of high-level international initiatives and associations, she has contributed to citizen science associations around the globe, the OECD Water Governance Initiative, the Group on Earth Observation, and to recent policy developments such as the UNESCO recommendations on open science. She currently co-chairs the CSGP Community of Practice on Citizen Science and Open Science. And last but not least, our fourth panelist is Rajesh Tandon. Rajesh is an internationally acclaimed leader and practitioner of participatory research and development. He's founder president of Participatory Research in Asia, a global center for participatory research and training since 1982. He is also UNESCO co-chair in community-based research and social responsibility in higher education. He also heads the Forum for Indian Development Corporation and the committee constituted by the University Grants Commission. He received his PhD in organizational behavior from Case Western. Rajesh supports and champions the cause of building organizations and capacities for marginalized communities through knowledge, learning, and empowerment. Okay. So with that, we'll go straight into the panel and the discussion. And we'll first of all talk about the section that's around the importance of participation of societal actors beyond the scientific community in open science and its governance. So a question for all the panelists is, in your view, what aspects of science can be strengthened with engagement of actors beyond the scientific community for sustainable development of societies and closing the knowledge gaps between and within countries? And also, which group of societal actors can play a role in this? So Rajesh, if it's okay with you, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Ona, and thank you, colleagues. Wonderful to join this conversation. As my introduction suggested to you, I have spent 40 years in developing the methodology of participatory research, the premise of which is twofold. First, that knowledge resides in multiple sites, and academia or research institutions are only one of them. People's everyday life is based on production, use, and sharing of knowledge, and experiential knowledge is a part of that. Indigenous knowledge is a part of that. The second premise of participatory research is that actionable change requires community's own participation in framing research questions. I have been championing this cause because, in my view, sustainable development goals can only be achieved if they are locally prioritized and contextually approached. Mega, global, national, even provincial statistics of achieving SDGs don't make a sense because exclusion happens systematically and structurally. So community engagement in framing SDG local, involving researchers, local community organizations, and local government institutions, because change action happens locally. Policies can be framed globally, but action happens locally on the ground. And we have, as our UNESCO chair in the last 5 years, promoted a global consortium we call Knowledge for Change, K4C. K4C is a global consortium which brings partnership between community organizations and academia around this precise question of identifying local priorities of SDGs. And there are examples of people working on water, on gender equality, on food security. Through this network, we have now 23 K4C hubs in 15 countries around the world. And if you visit UNESCO Chair's website, you will see all those details. But I believe that when we want to focus on accelerating achievement of SDGs, or even finding solutions to the climate change adaptation that communities are going through in everyday life, then partnership needs to start from the very framing of research questions. What is worth researching anyways? Let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Rajesh, so much for those points. Now let's hear from Uta.
Thank you so much, Ona, and I very much subscribe and second what Rajesh has so eloquently said. It's clear that we've seen a shift also in the way we do research, with research increasingly having to be challenge-driven and to be societally relevant. And there's no other way we can do this by really working with communities and working with those who are actually experiencing needs and issues on the ground. So bringing distinct communities and communities in the widest sense into the research process is really key. Paying particular attention how we bring marginalized communities in, of course, is also very important. That answers the question of how, but I would argue that equally important that answers the question of who we should bring in, but equally important is the question of how we do this. Just simply saying, oh, we're going to reach out to some people and ask them what they think. We really need to have the right methodologies in place, so we don't set up shop once and ask a couple of people to join us in a room. But we also need to make sure that all perspectives are taken into account, and we really need also clear agreement of how these perspectives are taken into account. So in some ways, we actually need to have agreement on how we govern the knowledge co-production process. Thank you.
Thank you for that a lot. Okay, and then Kate.
Thanks. I'd like to revisit something that Rajesh mentioned, in the idea that the knowledge within a society resides in many places. And I think in, considering the original question, like beyond the scientific community, what can we do to assist that? I want to press on the question of who's actually a scientist. And arguably, the mindset that we want to develop is that everyone has the capacity to engage in science. And that includes being able to find scientific resources that are a part of the openly, publicly available set of knowledge and access them, and then have the tools to be able to use them. And I think what this points toward is a real need for both a way that that knowledge and that information and those resources can be accessible in a practical sense, but also in an intellectual sense. We know that the situated knowledge, meaning information that is meaningful to individuals given their specific perspective, is really important. And that then people have the capacity to be able to apply, those tools and those data to the questions that they really care about. So I think that my main approach as someone involved in the funding space is that to some extent, marketing and advertisement to aid in the discoverability of such information is the most important aspect, and then building in educational components. And that allows all of this information that we do find to be used by the widest variety of people. And so I think considering open science and its applicability to people, not only as the availability of resources, but within the context of usage of those resources, is really important. And in terms of, again, addressing the specific question, like how do we actually make this happen? I think it means that we have to engage with a really wide variety of stakeholders. Education plays a key component, but that is not it. We need to engage in community leaders who can help us situate the knowledge in a way that makes it accessible. I'm excited to keep talking about some of these particular issues a little bit more in subsequent questions, but I'll end it there for now.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Kate. And now let's hear from Nick.
Well, and what I sense is going to be a theme of this panel discussion, I very much agree with all of what the panelists so far have said. And I think just building on some of the points that the other three panelists have made, I feel like really strongly that all aspects of science can be strengthened with the engagement of sort of the wider community. And in fact, it's that kind of engagement is absolutely necessary if we're going to sort of have a chance of meeting the sustainable development goals of effectively addressing sort of pressing global crises like the current COVID pandemic, like climate change. That really runs the gamut from question formation, right? Having broad communities involved in science helps, questions be asked in the context of science that are locally relevant, that have a tangible impact on people's lives, involving local communities and broad constituencies in the actual conduct of science, helps to make sure that science doesn't replicate the extractive practices that have been a hallmark of so many different types of science, where researchers will do research on communities, but not with them. And then in the dissemination and the impact of research involving communities actually, creates a link so that when that research is done, it stands a much better chance of actually being translated to tangible change on the ground in ways that improve people's lives and improves people's lives in ways that they have agency and autonomy over, that it's not some outside group coming from without imposing that change because they know best, but empowering local communities to make changes that can improve their lives, their communities, through knowledge that was co-created with them. And so I see that kind of deep involvement as essential to improving science and making it responsive to the SDGs. And one particular group, particularly in the context of this discussion, that I want to sort of highlight in specific, our students, are the next generation, who I feel like it's essential be involved in science and science policy. Throughout, that the next generation should have a seat at all of these tables, because they're the ones that will inherit sort of all these systems, all the problems, and having them sort of at the table where decisions are being made helps to both build that capacity but also shape current efforts in ways that I think are really important and sort of reflect the next generation that will inherit both the problems that we face and the systems that we're building to address those problems.
Those are all great points, Nick. Thank you so much. And that takes us, I think, very nicely to the second part of the panel today, which focuses on ways to engage societal actors beyond the scientific community, right? So I'll start with a question for Uta. So citizen scientists have a great potential in providing inputs to many scientific fields. So do you think the current scientific system has all the means to fulfill this potential? And what can be done better? And how can national, state, and non-state actors adapt science policies to make them more attentive to citizen science inputs?
Well, big question, in fact, a whole range of questions. So perhaps as we start talking about citizen science, perhaps good to state that this is really an umbrella term under which we have many forms of ways of engaging societal actors in the scientific knowledge production. Rajesh already talked more about the community-based bottom-up initiatives. We have forms of citizen science that are very clearly driven by the scientific community, very much focusing on the contribution to data collection and filling data gaps. And we also have interests from authorities at various levels of the governance system that are interested more in the participatory element. So it's an umbrella term and it has many shapes and sizes. In the open science context, I would argue it's the engine that actually opens up the scientific process. And if it's not the engine, then it's at least a really key part of opening up open science. Having said that, how open it is, how open citizen science is at the end of the day really is a matter of implementation. So there's no quick fix or no automatic results. So as we ponder how we embed citizen science then within science policies, on the one hand, we of course have a lot of help with the UNESCO recommendation on open science recently having been adopted that really provides a global framework, a global understanding and consensus of how we think about open science and how we think about the role of citizen science within open science as a key pillar. We see that of course now is a milestone from which we need to move on to implement and how we change science policies, and that's really a top-down process that will take some time to really reshape and rethink science policies in the member states. And those don't start on a blank page. We have existing science policies, and we also have existing movements within nation states where actors, of course, have thought about open science for at least a decade. There are many initiatives, platforms, collaboration platforms already building up, trying to grapple with what open science means within their specific science system. In the Netherlands, we've had the National Program of Open Science for a number of years, where big universities, research institutes started to get together and collaborate this, and now have to align their thinking and the definitions and the implementation to what's happening top down, let's say, from UNESCO. And at the same time, we have many practitioners, particularly in the citizen science community, that for many years have tried to argue for this relationship between citizen science and open science, and try to learn from each other bottom up in what we call communities of practice. And we have a global network, in fact, in our citizen science, open science community of practice, where we have more than 170 practitioners from more than 35 countries that regularly exchange about these bigger developments. So when we say what should happen to science policy, well, we should take into account all these developments. We should take the guidance and the clear framework from UNESCO. We should embrace the developments that are already happening nationally. And we should also not forget the practitioner community, who's also very well self-organized, let's say.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a very quick follow-up. Do you have any suggestions of how this could be implemented to make it a little bit more concrete?
Yeah, so it's a matter of knowing who's around, who's working on what. So it's to some extent it's about communication, and using all the channels we have so that we can really connect the dots within the national context, but also to connect with each other and not reinvent the wheel in every single country, but stay connected So UNESCO, of course, is launching this big partnership. There's a big global community developing there. As I mentioned, we have this existing community of practice on citizen science, open science, which people are very welcome to join. And it often is the missing link between people knowing what's happening in their country, in their neighborhood, in their region. So I can post a link to the community of practice if you like in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Uta. Yeah, so we'll now transition to Rajesh and a question that is, of course, along the theme of community engagement. So how can communities engage in the processes of knowledge, co-production, and decision-making? What are the skills that scientists and communities need to improve the exchange of and co-production of knowledge? Is the education system enabling in this regard? So Rajesh, we'll hear from you.
I think I want to follow up on what Uta was saying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation provides an international policy framework. In addition, it provides support to the possibility of building bridges across various segments of science. I have been working with the science community in India for the last 1.5 to 2 years since open science debate began. And the new science technology innovation policy of India is having an opening chapter on open science, borrowing heavily from UNESCO recommendation. But we had a conversation, a webinar with young scientists as part of Priya's 40th anniversary last month. And we will share that, where we invited them to talk about their understanding of what else science is. And none of them had heard anything about 40 years of participatory research movement in India. None of them had heard about people science movement in India. None of them had heard about citizen science happening in India and South Asia. So going back to what Nick was also saying, I am now working with Indian Institute of Science and Department of Science and Technology in India to create a program, a course, a learning opportunity for young scientists before they even start their professional research career, to understand what is the meaning of open science and who are the different actors within the country who are, or the region, who are already doing this kind of work. Because it's not that the work has not been going on, but it's going on separate worlds. We are all operating in our own echo chambers and have no opportunity to bridge, link, or connect. Importantly, UNESCO recommendation on the one hand, and Sustainable Development Goals and climate stress on the other hand, can now encourage bridging across various ways of understanding different types of practices, pedagogies, and epistemologies that are inherent on the ground, but are not visible to each other because all busy in our own networks, in our own fraternities. So this is, I think, the biggest challenge. And I hope the journal and the competition you are organizing and other ways we can think of, brainstorm, to connect young scientists, young researchers, to understand that there is rest of the world also doing something before they start, moving on in their career. So this is the right time to spread that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rajesh, for that answer. Yeah, and now along the theme of having the right to have a say in these scientific advancements and its benefits. So I have a question, for Nick. According to Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, quote, everyone has a right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits, end of quote. What are the tools and resources needed to fulfill this right for everyone? And also, what policies are needed to promote innovation and collaboration in this regard?
There are a lot. I feel like these are very generous questions for panelists. I can write a dissertation on these. So lots of room to answer, though I'm going to cheat on this one a little bit, which is, there are a lot of tools, I think, or resources that, I could mention in response to this, but I think it's probably more important to actually think a level up from that about, sort of how are these tools and resources built? Who are they built for? Who are they built by? Whose interests are prioritized, by these tools, by these resources? Because I think if we get those questions right, the right tools and resources will flow from that. But if those questions are wrong, if they are prioritizing the wrong interests, or not built with or for sort of a global community, they ultimately will not deliver on sort of achieving Article 27, as Ona was referring to. And so I think a couple sort of thoughts or fundamental aspects to try to get right in building tools and resources. One, many of these are reflected in the UNESCO recommendation on open science, but one that I think is absolutely essential is that they're aligned with the community's best interest, that they're either community owned or community aligned in a very sort of hardwired way, and not exclusively built for profit. I think where these tools are built and who's building them is also essential. There for decades has been, a continued centralization of our, scientific and scholarly infrastructure in Europe and North America. That continues. A lot of the, largest publications are, run by teams that are largely based in Europe and North America. Reggie Raju at the University of Cape Town has a really great sort of perspective on addressing that particular problem and his calls for the de-northernization of scholarly communication, of paying attention to where this work happens and the impact of where this work is happening has on how it happens and whose interests are served, right? When small university presses or small publishers in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, have to shutter or scale back their operations because their libraries feel like they have to spend more on, Elsevier, Springer Nature, Wyatt Leigh Taylor, and Francis journals, it means there's not a local, infrastructure that's much better placed to respond to, questions that are of local relevance and local interest. And instead it drives the sort of homogenization of scholarship and science, right? If you look at the editorial boards of the journals that influence a lot of disciplines, right? I haven't looked this morning at the New England Journal of Medicine's website, but I know previously in the not too distant past, there were more people on the editorial board from the Boston area than from the rest of the world combined. That's a problem. If you look at the Lancet's editorial board, it's similar in medicine. Those are like very specific examples, but I think are illustrative of the way that sort of where and by whom work happens has a really significant effect on sort of whose interests are served. And so, circling back to your question about tools and resources, I think we just have to be really intentional about, sort of how they're built, the sustainability models they use and who they're built for, to make sure they're actually built to achieve the UN SDGs, to achieve, realizing Article 27 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and not just simply to extract as much, money from the system, as possible for a handful of players while making the system worse off for everyone else.
Thank you, Nick, so much for that. And now we'll transition to Kate and ask about the funding aspect of the goals here. So the ultimate goal of open science is narrowing the growing knowledge and technology gaps and making science more inclusive. So in the current landscape of science, unequal access to resources is one of the barriers to equitable open science. How can research funders overcome this issue? Are there some good strategies in place? So Kate, over to you.
I really love the framing of this question and really centering the idea that open science is about inclusivity. I think scientists like to focus on the idea that it's a moral decision, that we're doing science, but we're going to do science in a better kind of way to make it accessible for everyone. And sometimes we go further and say that open science helps accelerate science, which again is still centering like this idea of everyone. Now, inclusion is sort of implicit within that, but I am really glad to have sort of like this answer coming after Nick, and this really nice explanation of what it means to be more explicit about that, about the audience and who it is that a particular resource is available for. And so specifically from the funder perspective, the CZI Open Science team funds a really wide variety of projects and organizations related to this space. And that includes supporting tools for open science, like open source software, platforms, including things like preprint servers, and education and capacity building organizations. So thinking about accessibility, which is in my brain really tied to inclusion, is really embedded in our funding strategy. And what we've been doing over the last few years is experimenting more with what it means to center inclusion as an aspect of a particular funding approach. So one example of that, I was really excited to hear Uda mentioning communities of practice. This is a growing trend within both scientific communities and within sort of broader scientific plus sort of non-scientist communities. And really what our program has been doing is thinking about what it means to support specific audiences from underrepresented groups, often as those interests intersect with specific scientific concerns. I think what all of this sort of points towards, though, is that like funders, even with very large budgets, cannot do everything all at once. And so we also know that the specific audience matters. And so then it looks like what we're doing is picking and choosing and being very piecemeal in how it is that we're attempting to approach the idea of inclusion for a specific project. But the truth is that we are attempting to test things to see if they work, attempting to use checkpoints to see if a certain approach is going to be suitable for a given audience. And that type of matchmaking takes time, and it takes a lot of continual assessment and iteration. And, you know, it's something that we continue to work on to figure out, like, what are the levers that we can pull for a given approach at a given point in time, and ideally then be able to scale those up so that inclusion means more for a broader array of people. And so it's challenging to be able to say, like, well, are you really being that open? Like, are you really funding open science if you're still only making it accessible for this one group? And it's, you know, really, that's a criticism of our mindfulness and our attempt to make sure that we're doing things in a diligent kind of way. And so the basic punchline is that what funders can and should do, and what I like to think that our particular team does, and what a lot of other funders of open science try to focus on, is finding particular approaches that'll work given a certain situation with a mind towards being able to scale that up, and being careful not to assume too much that an approach that works well in one place will work well in another place.
Yeah, thank you, Kate, for that. Yeah, you always have to take into account many aspects of that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great. So that will take us.
I think Uda has a comment to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm never quite sure whether I should use the digital hands up or the
yes,
physical hands up.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Of course, Kate, what you're saying is music to my ears. You know, as a scientist, as a researcher, you know, and working on the science of citizen science and seeing how we can make science more inclusive. But I also have the hands-on experience that I know just how difficult that is, and how difficult it is to predict not only how successful we will be in reaching various communities and truly being inclusive, but it also means that the whole process is far less predictive in terms of results. And, you know, a lack of prediction is not something that many funders are keen on. So I'm very happy, I'd be very interested to hear from you, you know, how you find the balance as from the funder side, because we're always trying to, as researchers, to sort of stretch the room we get from the funding side to say, we can only partly predict, but we can tell you what these communities really want if we truly co-design science or do open science with them on the ground. So I'd be very interested to hear your views on that.
If it's all right for me to go ahead and respond. I can also say, like, I come from the perspective of a researcher too. So it's like, I've been on the side of trying to apply for grants, and now from the funding side, I think that what the approach that I tend to like to take as someone who now funds is being able to have real conversations with scientists who are applying for grants, because the specific focus of what folks at a funding agency are considering at a given point in time tends to shift. And sometimes that shift is very subtle, and sometimes it's very obvious and transparent. And figuring out exactly what it is, it's just as much about timing, the time and place of an idea, as the quality of the idea itself. And figuring out exactly sort of which type of intervention seems really appealing at a given point in time, I know can be really challenging. And it's sometimes challenging for us. As again, funders are also working within, levels of hierarchy with, sort of directives coming from our leadership telling us the types of things we should be caring about, because that also means like the Open Science program is like one of multiple programs at CZI. And so what are the things that we can do across programs that are going to yield a more cohesive approach? And I know that makes it all a real moving target, but also the secret is that I've only been a program manager for a couple of months now. And so like, I've been thinking a lot about this, this mindset of what it takes to be a funder, and recognizing that sometimes we're able to divert money to, this is a great idea, the timing is really important, and we're going to make it happen. And other times the timing is just not right. And that can be really frustrating, and I think an impediment to sort of the ongoing work of scientists. But at the same time, I continue to trust in the idea that the things that we do as a funder are sort of like an aggregate of a whole bunch of projects that are working together. And sometimes then the timing works out better later on. And so these are my lessons from like 3 months as a program manager. I appreciate being able to address that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's great to see one panelists engage with each other. So thank you, Tef, for doing that. Okay, so then we'll transition to the third section of the panel today, and it surrounds the topic of enabling inclusiveness in the future of open science. So the first question, and this will be for all the panelists, how do we ensure the participation of marginalized communities and traditional and indigenous knowledge holders in policymaking and collaborative governance of science? And I think that goes along, Kate or Uta or Nick, if you would like to start, yeah.
Yeah, I think if I may start, it connects indeed to our previous discussions in some ways, but it takes us more down to the practicalities of what it means to really ensure inclusiveness and understand what are the practical barriers for marginalized communities, whether it's linguistics or disabilities or socioeconomic factors. That don't allow them to be part of the process that we so generously open to them. We see in our work with communities and with very much the co-designed form of citizen science that we also need to get out of our comfort zone, and we need to extend our working hours. So it's easy enough for us to work with authorities and other scientists between 9 to 5, but volunteers and communities, and the more rural they are, we don't catch them between 9 to 5 because they also have jobs or they have families to take care of. So it really means, we need to be more flexible in a very, very practical way. And sometimes it means we work with different communities first bilaterally before we can really bring them together to bring, let's say, inclusiveness to a good end by having all views at the same time at the table. So these are some of the practical aspects that really come into play. And it means that our work as scientists is fundamentally shifting, where we have to get out of comfort zones. And we also have to do this in a team effort, because many of the skills that we need in order to do inclusive open science require forms of communication that we haven't been trained for, or we just simply need to build our team. So it's more of a team effort by now that we need, because it's no longer the subject matter scientific expertise that we need. We're bringing different people into the process, and that makes it richer, but also more complex by various dimensions.
Yeah, thank you, Uta. Nick or Kate, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think Uta's exactly right, and yeah, particularly like the point on sort of doing things like extending our working hours and recognizing, that the best time for us to engage, is oftentimes likely, not the best time, or just not possible for others. I also think, just sort of the framing of inclusion and participation sort of merit closer examination as well, right? Because that language implies those communities coming to something else, right? Inclusions, I think there's been an increasing realization that the way that a lot of organizations often think about inclusion, or how do I support these people to come to participate in my thing, rather than thinking about how do I change the way that I do things? How do I change myself, my organization, so that it is more natural, is a more welcoming space for other communities. And I feel like that's really essential in this, that, we shouldn't think about, sort of how do we sort of get other communities involved in what we do in our science, but how do we change science so that it is inclusive of those communities, of their ways of knowing, of their priorities. And I think, to me, that really has to start with relationship building. Again, sort of getting back to, sort of Uda's point about, sort of doing that work that allows for that kind of relationship building. But instead of just, starting the conversation with an invitation to be involved in a specific project, just starting to build the relationship with those communities, getting a sense of what their interests and priorities are, what their concerns are, why they would be hesitant to get involved, and then looking at how the work itself can change to be responsive, so that those communities see themselves in the work and the end goals that they're seeking to advance, rather than just sort of invited after the fact, right? That this work has to be foundational. It can't be bolted on afterwards in support of a project that's sort of already left the station. It has to be fundamental if it's going to be real.
May I respond to Nick? Because I just wanted to follow up on what I think are really excellent points of really breaking open the terminology on inclusiveness and participation, who's inviting whom into what. And so if we're talking about opening up science and open engagement of societal actors, we should be open to moving away from the implicit assumption that science will still be initiated and driven by scientists. So in our field, we're very much working on how can we come up with methodologies that make this process really neutral, in the sense that it doesn't matter which actor starts it. It could be community driven, it could be authority driven, it could be funder driven, or it could be science driven, whatever you like, or industry driven for that matter. It doesn't really matter. The methodology itself that we come up with, by which we agree on what important issues are and what data and knowledge we actually need and how we can act on those methodologies really merit thinking. And of course, they themselves have to be developed and tested and validated and then shared and widely applied. But I think that the important point is there should be no implicit assumption of who's really starting and inviting anybody else in. Of course, those forms of science also have their legitimacy. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. But while we're busy opening things up, let's also do it, in the most ethical way we possibly can.
I love sort of pushing on this idea of what it means to engage in these types of collaborations in a general sense, and sort of the mindset that we need to take. I want to push it even just a little bit further and say that ensuring this type of participation, because we here on this panel are members of the privileged group of highly educated in-group of the scientific community, that often we need to spend a lot more time listening. And that goes along with assuming less, but it also goes along with the idea of maybe we need to expand the sort of space that is occupied in our brain about even more basic assumptions we make, like, is this the important person that we should be talking to? In science, we're great optimizers. We want to make things as efficient as possible, which often optimizes for things like productivity and progress. And the truth is that that works well when you have an established system, But when you are attempting to perturb or disrupt the system, like you are, if you're trying to make things more inclusive, it requires more effort in terms of both like the emotional and mental side of checking yourself and being empathetic with whoever it is that you're talking to. I also sometimes see a pattern in scientists sort of thinking like, oh, is this even the person that I want to be working with right now? They don't seem like a very good fit for my type of interest. And if I hear that, then I automatically need to take a step back and say like, okay, but why are you saying that? Is it because someone else is using different types of terminology and you just think it's going to be too much work to engage with them? Maybe that's actually a signal that, you know, you need to be spending more time figuring out how to work with them. Because again, a broader step to meet someone else where they are is going to be a bigger disruption to the system. And again, like that's not a hard and fast rule. I know that there's a need for us to continue our projects and get things done, but that's mostly a challenge for us to, again, spend more time listening and less time making assumptions and trying to be directive. And also, you know, doing what you can in a position of privilege to be able to ensure voices at the table, and to ensure that you're hearing those voices and not just, you know, letting them speak.
Thank you. Thank you.
I dare come in again?
Of course.
Shut me up if you want to. But I think this is a really great conversation, and the points that Kate made are so salient of really how we position ourselves as a researcher, who we let speak, who we speak to in the first place, etc. And it also raises attention to the fact that open science is also about not only letting all kinds of other stakeholders, non-scientists, into the process, but actually being more transdisciplinary, working across silos. And here the strong part, of course, is many of the reflections that Kate alluded to is what several of the social science disciplines train us to do anyway. We have to reflect about what our research is, how we change, you know, the environment which we're supposedly objectively researching, whether we position ourselves as a post-positivist and we accept the subjectivity of what we're studying, whether we're an ethnographer and fully embed ourselves, you know, for months in a local community to truly understand the culture, etc. There's such richness out there already. We don't need to reinvent this, but we need to better connect ourselves across scientific disciplines to draw on the strengths. And it comes back to the issue of team effort that I mentioned before, because I can imagine that this is very far for many natural scientists. That doesn't mean they all need to be fully trained as social scientists. Let's team up, let's do science together and bring the right team to the table to do this in inclusive and ethical ways.
Thank you, Uta, for saying that and jumping in. Okay, so now a question, a follow-up, sort of a question is, of course, really related for Uta. So what skills are needed to facilitate the recognition of citizen science by decision makers and scientists?
If I may jump in on the citizen science part, the recognition of citizen science by decision makers and other scientists, we really see that there are two major obstacles to really mainstreaming citizen science. And one is the awareness that it exists, what it is about, what it entails. And then comes the acceptability. Well, is the data any good? You know, what does it mean for my role? You know, if I'm authority, how's it going to change my personal job, etc. All kinds of worries. So the entire field of the science of citizen science is trying to substantiate the value and the impact that citizen science has on science itself, on governance, but also on society more broadly, and of course also on the environment, which many of the monitoring schemes, environmental monitoring schemes, are trying to, at the end of the day, trickle into an improved environment, physical environment of people's local settings. So that work is really important, but you know, if it sits on a shelf, it's not going to be changing anybody's awareness and acceptability. So the communication comes in again. It's good that the field of science of citizen science is producing that knowledge, is producing the evidence, and we're trying to do this in many different ways, coming up with impact stories and with full-blown impact assessments and evaluation. So whatever we can pull up to really hit the spot and find different ways of communicating, both with the scientific community, but also particularly with decision makers and policy makers, is then really helpful to start creating that awareness and shifting those mindsets.
Those are great points. Thank you so much, Uta. And then I have a question for Kate and Nick. It's sort of the shaping of the future, right? So how can the next generation get involved in shaping the future of open science in a way that takes into account all views? And then this is coming from a question that we received in the chat during our panel today. That's sort of a related aspect. How can universities incentivize policy publications from their trainees to connect science to society for the next generation? So Kate or Nick, please go ahead.
Nick,
Right,
you've been pretty quiet. I think you should go ahead and take this one first.
So I think, I think that sort of students, early career researchers, the next generation should be, as I said earlier in the panel, involved at all levels. And I think a lot of the most interesting and impactful ideas come out of sort of the student and next generation community, that sort of folks that are early on in their career, sort of not even quite yet begun to see the world in different ways, aren't as bound by the way things have been done, and I think have more space to sort of see what's possible, and oftentimes the energy to bring those possibilities to life. I'm struck by how many of I think the most interesting projects in the open research space were conceived by folks when they were students or early career researchers, early career librarians, even if they've sort of matured in their career since then. There's a lot of infrastructure that's being built that was conceptualized by folks as students or early career professionals, including folks that I can see are in the room with us. Right, there's a really incredible initiative called Pre-Review that seeks to sort of build community around sort of working together to review preprints, to expand the reviews that preprints receive, but also to educate students and early career academic professionals about how to give good feedback, and I think address some of the toxicity that often happens in that area of research. That was conceptualized and launched by early career folks. The Center for Science and Society that's led by Danielle Robinson. A lot of the roots of that came, when she was, finishing, her training, and immediately afterwards, and saw the need for the, sort of kind of backbone organization to, take on the work of like admin and overhead, so that organizations like Pre-Review or many others now can focus on the, sort of the work of doing the work that they were started to do. There's an incredible project called OA Works that started originally as the open access button by a group of like public health medical students, just seeing how universal the experience of hitting paywalls was, and originally wanting to capture their stories, and then evolving that idea, while still students, to helping folks get around paywalls, to sending authors of articles automated messages when somebody hit a paywall for their article, sort of automating the process of asking for a copy. That's now sort of blossomed into this entire technical project, making it, easy for authors to deposit their article with literally like drag and drop in like one click, and it auto-populates the metadata. And there are a bunch of other like technical things, but it was all had its roots in med students seeing a problem, then just sort of diving into trying to put something together to address it. And so I guess that maybe the takeaway message that I'm hopefully building up to is that students and early career folks don't need to wait to get involved. In fact, a lot of the most interesting and impactful leadership in the open research movement is coming from folks that are, within 5 or 8 years of, graduating with their, with their degree. I do think, though, that the community has a huge amount of room for improvement for supporting those early career folks. It's often a lot harder to get grant funding when you don't have, a long career and the network and the connections that come with that career. The skepticism, that I suppose, can be understandable, but, in supporting folks that don't have as much of a track record, and the invitation and sort of thoughtful support to cultivate, sort of those next generation leaders, I think it's a really important area of focus and improvement for the community. I suppose that's one place to pass it off to Kate.
Yeah, Kate, please.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, for bringing up some of my favorite organizations, not just because some of them are CZI funded, but also because they are, groups that I do feel like are capable of helping be transformative in the space of open science. And I also want to add on that you don't need to go and start a new organization directly after finishing your graduate work to have an impact. Getting involved in some of these organizations is, I think, a really important part of sort of onboarding yourself to the ways that other people are thinking about disrupting the system already. That it's also kind of a counterpoint to what I said earlier, where we need to spend more time listening and less time talking. I think when you are early career and are trying to figure out what the different pieces of the system are that do not resonate with you, it's also a challenge to be able to find your voice. And to be able to say, especially to someone like your PhD advisor, perhaps, hey, that way that you've been doing things, maybe that's not the best way. Maybe there is another way, and that way might even be better. And so figuring out how it is to even put those types of concerns to word, I think is a really important first step. And to make that happen, sometimes it is useful to be able to find like-minded individuals. And Nick's reference to a few organizations reminded me that in my previous hat that I wore as a open science specialist at CZI, I helped develop a website that includes a lot of organizations related to this particular subject matter. And so I put a link in the chat, and I see Nick also shared a link to pre-review. I need to include some of these preprint organizations in my resource page. So I appreciate having them. I'm going to go file an issue on GitHub right after this. But being able to find a community of people that will allow you to be able to learn some of the language that may not be familiar with you, learned how to put words to some of the issues that you may be feeling, I think is a really low risk kind of way for you to be able to start your engagement. And I think the idea of like getting involved in shaping policy, I think feels like a really long reach. Like, what can I do? I'm one person. The truth is that there are huge things that we can do to encourage culture change. And culture change is a really large driver behind why policy can change. And so your input and your participation can be really important in those contexts too.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And it's really encouraging to hear that, as a PhD candidate at Hopkins too. Great. So then I would like to now take us to the open questions part from the audience, and we had a question from one of our members in the audience. The question is about how do we ensure the integrity of open science materials, such as standards for peer review? Who should do this, and how should this be done? And this is regarding UN or other players. So any of the panelists are welcome to jump in about this question.
I'm trying to parse this a little bit. So if I'm hearing this right, it's asking about ensuring standards of open science related to something like peer review, which I think is speaking to something like preprints, like how do we share science, which may or may not be peer reviewed. I think this is my gentle reminder as someone who has published many papers and reviewed many more, that peer review is not an infallible system. And so our basic standards for is this good science are partly reliant on our own opinions. I also think that peer review is one way of thinking about confidence in a publication. There are other ways. And so having more public dialogue about manuscripts that have been made available, either peer reviewed or not, is really, really important as well. And I also think that, you know, it's incumbent on each of us as scientists to be able to evaluate sort of like scientific evidence and also be able to place it in the context of other research that's coming out at a given point in time. It is the cumulative body of knowledge that matters more than the individual pieces of it. And so I think, you know, that's it's not a very satisfying answer. I think that, like, I come from the world of software, right? And people tend to have this question a lot more about, like, well, how can we trust that software that's being developed in the open is actually any good if any old person can go and like make a code contribution? Well, the truth is that when something is out in the open, you have many, sometimes an order of magnitude more eyes on it. And with that many more eyes on it, you have more likelihood of catching issues with it. And so in some cases, open availability is a different type of validation and verification that what you're dealing with is sort of like accurate and appropriate. And again, that's a different way of thinking about it than saying like, well, I have a company who's written this software who has a legal assurance that, you know, if the software screws up, then they'll be accountable for it. When the truth is that most software companies don't even have those assurances themselves, right? It's like, so again, understanding what it means to be certain or confident in something and whether or not there are other ways that you can achieve that, that's the mindset that we're starting to see developing among a lot of people within the scientific community and without. And I hope that helps start to address some of these issues of confidence in open resources, specifically and related to like open manuscripts that may or may not have been peer reviewed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kate.
If I may add, perhaps from the other side, what we also see with open access journals, fully open access journals, that they're being far more specific in the guidance and requirements that they place on the peer reviewers. So, you know, you get a lot more structure and a lot more prompts and checking really that this is your field of expertise and asking you to reflect, you know, on your role in the peer review process. So I think that's from the other side, from the other end, also helping to do the best we can to ensure integrity in the peer review process.
Sorry, moderator.
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Khalid Sani. I'm the one who asking about the peer review. So are you telling me that the bogus journals or the predatory journals later will be part of open science? Thank you.
So I was actually going to touch that particular topic of the, you know, sort of oft-raised concern about low quality open journals. And I think, you know, there are a couple of important points to consider. One is that I think Kate's absolutely right that, you know, sort of opening up the peer review process is a really powerful way to address that, right? Because if the peer review process is transparent, it's a lot easier to see that there wasn't real peer review done on these articles. So I think, you know, there are ways in which openness itself serves as, you know, sort of mounts an antibody response to that particular problem. But I think, you know, well, so a couple of things. One is, you know, sort of the low quality issue is not unique to open. There are plenty of low quality subscription-based journals. And, you know, often they're created for other reasons. You know, there are examples of publishers creating journals for pharmaceutical companies to publish, you know, articles that are, you know, have glowing reviews of the efficacy of, you know, their products. which is, a different reason than why, maybe some, low quality open access journals exist, which, I think the root of is often the business model. And so, I think if we get the business model and sort of the reasons why we're doing open science right, it solves a lot of these problems. So if, for example, we move away from article processing charge-based business models for open, where, there's an author side payment to make an article open, there's not an incentive anymore to create these low quality journals because there's not the kind of money flow in the system that, makes that profitable for unscrupulous actors. And so, if we think about the structure of how we're pursuing open science and make sure that it's community owned and community aligned, I think it really, will go a long way to addressing those concerns, which I think are real and, need to be taken seriously. And I think the community is, right. If you look at the directory of open access journals, for example, they've done a lot of work to look at the rigorousness of peer review, of sort of the infrastructure of the journal before listing it there. And I think there are some other community-based initiatives taking similar steps to address the problem. So I think there is promising work being done there, but I think these kind of fundamental questions about sort of how are we structuring the system and, sort of for what reasons is it being structured that way? If we get those questions right, it will address, sort of those kinds of problems and make sure there's a lot less space for unscrupulous actors to take advantage of, sort of structures to, extract money from these systems, in ways that, benefit them but harm science.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nick. And we have just one last question from one of our attendees here, and it goes along the lines of asking about the publication process, the peer reviews. So how do we encourage new ideas in open science publication from trainees, etc.? And anyone is welcome to jump in and we'll close after.
I didn't really catch the question and don't see the chat. If you could kindly repeat it.
Oh yes, I think it was sent to one of us. So maybe it's not public, but basically what authors should be thinking about, what ideas for the open science publication, this kind of area.
Gosh, I think that question has been answered by the end of this webinar, hasn't it? I mean, we've touched on so many aspects of what comes into play in open science and governing the process of scientific knowledge production under an open science framework. So I think if that question is still open, please listen to the webinar again. I'm sure you'll be inspired.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and with that, I think we'll finish the Q&A session. And Adriana, if you would like, to close or hear final remarks from everyone. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone. It's been really interesting to be in the background and watch and listen to all the great points you made. I think that it ties really well into our next couple of events that we'll focus on incentives, sort of this questions about universities, and a few other things. So I want to just share a little bit about what's coming next. So on May 20th, we'll be talking more about incentives, rewards, and evaluation methods for open science in the scientific process, including how to incorporate open science at different stages and also in policy decisions. And then the last webinar in the series, which is June 10th, will focus on fostering international cooperation, reducing gaps of knowledge through open science, and also more specifically on reducing digital technological knowledge gaps between and within countries. So I think we will delve really deeply into some of the things that we touched on today a little bit. And so we'll encourage you to join us for the next events as well. As well as, again, as I said, we post all the recordings on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe to listen to these talks, and then we look forward to your submissions to the special issue. And thanks again for joining today, and have a great weekend.